On Friday, April the 13th, 1928, in West Plains, Missouri, at a dance hall attended by 60 people, a massive explosion took the lives of 40 of them. An inquest held on the 26th was unable to determine what caused this explosion, and to this day nobody knows. The explosion was truly massive. It damaged the courthouse so badly that the courthouse was no longer able to be used and was eventually torn down and rebuilt. At the time, the courthouse was only 45 years old. Most of the people who died were young people. They were from nearby cities surrounding West Plains, as well as West Plains itself. They were people who had come home to visit for Easter, who otherwise would have lived somewhere else. These dances were held in West Plains every Friday. This particular night, as I said, there were about 60 people, and had they not played the last song, most people probably would have left the building. However, someone unknown requested a special song be played. It was called At Sundown. I have found recordings of this song online. I was not able to find one that I could include here, so I will put a link to one of these recordings in the description. Somewhere in the middle of this song is when the explosion occurred. Most people had absolutely no chance of escaping whatsoever. Those who did were either blown from the building by the blast itself, or were strong enough and close enough to the edge to pull themselves out. Some people believe the reason more women died than men is because women may have lacked the strength to do this. It was also reported that the heavier clothing that men wore protected them from burns more than the very willowy, fashionable dresses the women were wearing for the party, which probably were a more flammable material than what their male counterparts were wearing. What follows is a sample of newspaper reporting in the days following the disaster. A blast kills 40. The deaths in West Plains, Missouri disaster stagger the city. Dance hall is wrecked. Shocked citizens of Ozark Town turn efforts to relief work. Discuss a suicide theory. Prosecutor to probe possibility that destruction of building was intentional. A coroner's jury Tuesday learned that J.W. Weiser, dead motor car dealer who operated a garage under the dance hall in which 40 persons were killed, had collected 17 used motor cars and placed them in the garage the night of the explosion. It was said he carried $10,000 insurance on his garage stock and $3,000 on the used cars. At least 40 persons were killed here Friday night when an explosion occurred in a garage beneath the Bond Hall, where a public dance attended by more than 60 persons was in progress. The explosion was so sudden, and the spread of the fire which followed it so rapid, that those persons in the hall who were not thrown clear of the building by the explosion were caught in the flames and the falling structure. The picture shows just had dismissed their second show crowds when the catastrophe occurred. Many persons with either friends or relatives in the building witnessed the explosion. Some of them were thrown from their feet. As soon as they had recovered from the shock, they rushed into the flames and desperately endeavored to rescue their family members and townsmen. The possibility that J.W. Weiser, operator of the garage below the dance hall, set off the blast either accidentally or intentionally was being investigated by H.D. Green, Jr., prosecuting attorney. Weiser formerly was a Pentecostal minister. He had been in West Plains about 2 years and was known to have been violently opposed to dancing. Frequently in his sermons he condemned it. R.G. Martin, a business competitor in the motor car sales business, died in the explosion. When Weiser came to West Plains from Alton, Missouri, he had about $10,000. His business did not prosper, and at the time of his death he was in financial straits. Mr. Green said he believed Weiser was insolvent. Thursday, the day before the explosion, Weiser received 2 business letters. One of them was from the district distributor of Oakland cars at St. Louis. It told him his franchise as a dealer was to be taken away from him. The other was from the General Motors Acceptance Corporation and stated that unless Weiser took care of his financial obligations, legal steps would be instituted. Both letters were in Weiser's pockets when his body was found 20 feet from the rear door of his garage. The movements of Weiser the night of the blast have been investigated enough to show they were unusual. His widow told the prosecutor and others that her husband had not been at home after 4 o'clock Friday afternoon. He did not return for dinner and did not say he was going to stay away. He did not tell his wife where he was going when he left home. Usually he told her if he was to be absent. There may have been as many as 80 persons in or around the dance hall or the adjacent buildings. The explosion converted a gay dancing party into a frenzied tempest of suffering and calamity. Darkness encased the entire town after the explosion wrecked the lighting system and added to the terror. Happy crowds, leaving a picture show shortly before the mighty blast rocked the town, were stricken with the horror of the scene as flames shot up from the building. Men who had relatives in the burning wreckage went fiercely to the almost hopeless task of fighting fire and digging into the wreckage. All through the night and long past dawn the citizenry toiled. Many of the injured were picked up on the streets far from the scene of the blast. H.C. Allen, prominent merchant, was blown 55 feet and was found with both legs broken and an arm torn off. 3 or 4 of the dancers were seen crawling away from the wreckage. Something had saved them. Perhaps they had been thrown from open windows where they were sitting out the dance. Men, whose bodies were bleeding from the explosion, rushed back to the hopeless scene of the fire, only to be repulsed by the heat, the flames, the cruel, torch-like furnace of burning gasoline. A.E. Sieberling, night marshal, was standing just across the street from the dance hall when the explosion occurred. There was a flash, a roar, and I was sent sprawling on the sidewalk, he said. I thought at first somebody had blown a safe. Then I heard the screams of the distressed and ran for the fire wagon. Almost as quickly as the debris settled in a pile, it was enveloped in flames as though it had been saturated with oil. Reverend W.E. Brown of Poplar Bluff, presiding elder of the Methodist Episcopal Church South and eyewitness of the catastrophe, said he heard 2 explosions, with the first a small one, followed by a terrific blast, which tossed the second story of the brick building into the air and then allowed it to collapse into flames, which started almost simultaneously. I walked to the window to see the floor of the dance hall lurch like the deck of a ship in the ocean waves during a storm, Reverend Brown said. Young people were running wildly. I could see them through the windows of the hall, trying frantically to get out. Then flames shot to the roof and enveloped the dancers. I saw women clinging to men and screaming to be saved. Then there was a deafening crash, and then the entire building, roof and all, collapsed, pitching them into the fiery pit below. Bishop W.F. McMurray of Fayette, Missouri, was in a hotel room just back of the dance hall. Windows of his room were shattered and the room disarranged, but he escaped injury. A continual stream of people kept moving through the morgues all day. This afternoon, the town was crowded with curious spectators and people seeking relatives. We do not need any outside help, said Mayor J.P. Harlan. Those injured are not believed to be in a serious condition. Most of the victims were members of well-known and well-to-do families. John Wilson of Thayer, 28 miles from West Plains, said the explosion woke him. Many other persons in Thayer and distant points were awakened by the blast. The victims included residents of Mountain Grove, Kabul, and other nearby towns, whose custom it was to attend the weekly dances at West Plains. Mayor J.P. Harlan of West Plains was in Springfield at the time, but returned early this morning to assist in the rescue work. Members of the National Guard were pressed into service, and numerous citizens were deputized as special police to assist in maintaining order at the wreckage. In digging in the ruins this afternoon, workmen found the 500-gallon gasoline storage tank in the Weiser garage was intact and had not exploded. This led to the belief the explosion was the result of the ignition of gasoline fumes by Weiser when he struck a match upon entering the garage. Property damage was estimated at about $175,000. The flames from the garage building swept through the two-story Adams and Riley buildings, destroying them completely. These buildings housed the E.M. Laird Plumbing Company, the Ridgeway Cleaning Company, and a confectionery store. The Western Union office in another building, the West Plains Bank, and the Arcade Hotel also were damaged. Burial of the victims will begin this afternoon with funeral services for Major Robert Mullins, a veteran of the World War. Major Mullins will be given a military funeral. He served overseas with the American Expeditionary Forces. W.H. Evans, Chicago traveling salesman, who assisted in saving lives of persons trapped in the Weiser building after the blast that wrecked it Friday night, said, "The cries and calls of the persons buried under the blazing debris, persons we knew we couldn't do a thing for, will remain with me until I die. It was horrible," Mr. Evans declared. "They didn't have a chance. The front of the building was blown out, and the upper floor collapsed. They were buried into a blazing inferno from which there was no escape. Rescue work couldn't be carried on. The flames prevented us from doing anything except just standing by and hearing their cries. I was standing with two other traveling men in front of the commercial hotel, which is almost directly across the street from the Weiser building. Suddenly, there came a tremendous blast that sounded like a dynamite bomb. Plate glass all along the street was shattered, and the very ground trembled. We rushed across the street to the demolished building. Hanging from some kind of an electric line was a man. He had been blown from a second-story window and had managed to seize the wires. We called to him to drop, and we would catch him. He did so and was only slightly injured. The next thing we did, I think, we were the first to arrive at the building, was called to the fire department. When the truck arrived, we put a ladder up to a second-story window where 4 men were standing among the flames and calling for help. They all got out safely, having only burns and cuts. I think the 5 men we assisted in getting out of the demolished building were the only ones, with the exception of those blown out and not killed. There wasn't a thing the crowd could do. The remains of the building were just a blazing hell. We could hear the agonized screams and cries of men and women buried under the flaming debris, but we were unable to get to them. B.N. Cade of Kansas City was in a room of the Arcade Hotel, a window of which overlooked the scene of the disaster. He was knocked from a chair in which he was sitting when the explosion occurred. At once there were flames, Cade said. The blaze was the most unusual I ever saw. In the center seemed to be a pale green circle, like the pinwheel in motion. At the edge, the green became a darker hue, surrounded by yellow flames. I could see some of the men and women running around, and others lying under the timbers. I had been thinking only a few seconds before, as I looked from my window over into the dance hall, that the young people there were certainly having a good time and enjoying themselves. I ran down to the street, and there were some other men there who had been attracted by the explosion, but we were unable to do anything to save the imprisoned people. Roy Crane, a clerk in Bohr's drugstore, his head bandaged and his legs and arms burned in the blast here, told how it felt to be caught at the mercy of the flames. "I was just watching them dance," he said. "The floor lifted upward with us. Women screamed. Men prayed. Then we were blinded by the flash of the fire and began falling downward. Many dancers went down clasping their partners tightly in their arms. I never will forget the horrible look on their faces. Finally, the seemingly endless fall came to an end. We had reached the bottom, and all around us bricks and heavy timbers were falling. Flames were crawling around us. We were helpless, held down by the weight of the debris. My legs were pinned down by a girder. I had been struck on the head by falling materials. I just had resigned myself to what was coming when I looked a little way over and saw a girl hanging over a piece of timber. My eyes were on her when the flames struck her. I saw her face and heard her scream. My God, I thought, I can't die like that. I struggled and finally was successful in freeing my legs. I crawled through the fire, then to safety. It was a matter of strength getting out of that. I believe that is the reason more men escaped than women, and I believe more would have escaped had they not chosen to remain with their wives or partners. The building between the West Plains Bank and the dance hall was formerly a saloon operated by Noe and Jones. On the second floor were apartments. Arnold Merck, a carpenter, and his son, Charles Merck, aged 17 years, had the front rooms. Eldon White, a friend of young Merck, was visiting him at the time of the tragedy. He had his hand on the doorknob to leave when there was a terrific blast. Merck was buried in the wreckage and crawled out unhurt. His son, Charles, perished. The white youth fought his way out through the wreckage and fire, for the building in which he was standing also was blown into a massive wreckage. Persons coming to the fire found White in the street, perfectly nude, with only his shoes on and some tatters of his underclothing dangling from his shoe tops. He was burned and bloody almost from head to foot. Refusing aid, he ran all the way to his home 6 blocks away. When someone asked him what was the matter, he said, "The dance hall blowed up." 2 Ava boys in the tragedy. 2 Ava boys were in the tragedy. They were Chester Holstein and Charles Fisher, who had motored here to attend the dance. Instead of an evening of pleasure, it was turned into a night of terror. Fisher, a crack high school athlete, was identified by a fraternity charm found on the body. His parents, Mr. and Mrs. Dolph Fisher, came to identify the body. Mr. Fisher is proprietor of the Ozark Hotel at Ava. There was absolutely nothing to identify any of the charred bodies as that of Chester Holstein. His parents, Mr. and Mrs. J.T. Holstein, the former an Ava merchant, came to West Plains with a large party of friends to see if they could not possibly identify their son. Reverend W. E. Brown, presiding elder of the Poplar Bluff district of the M.E. Church South, and Reverend J. C. Montgomery, pastor of the Southern Methodist Church at Cape Girardeau, were sitting in the Arcade Hotel talking with Bishop McMurtry of Fayette, Missouri. They had been here attending a Methodist district conference and were waiting for a train. "I heard a terrible explosion that almost threw me off my feet," says Reverend Montgomery. "I looked out of the hotel window directly into the dance hall. I saw flames shoot up and heard people screaming, saw them running about the hall. You could actually see the clothing burning from their bodies. Then there was another crash as the building caved in. It was the most horrifying sight in my life." One of the most heroic to emerge from the disaster which had crushed this city is Mrs. Paige Robertson, assistant to Mrs. Kitty McFarland, West Plains undertaker, who was killed in the blast. Mrs. Robertson went about the care of the charred bodies of her townsmen, refusing aid from outside undertakers who have offered their assistance. Her employer is among the dead, identified. But Mrs. Robertson also knows that 2 of the unidentified dead are her sisters. They are Miss Frances Drago, manager of the Western Union, and Mrs. Wallace Rogers of Emporia, Kansas. Mrs. Rogers was here on a visit to her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Charles H. Drago. Els Sieberling, night policeman, was standing in front of the Atterbury's store on the north side of Court Square when the explosion took place. Shattered glass fell all around him. He was nearly knocked down by the shock. He ran for the scene of the explosion and was joined by A.W. Landis and Edward B. Toller. "I ran to the hall, and already flames were leaping high from the halls," Sieberling said. "I could not get close because of the intense heat. The men and women were screaming, and I could hear some of them moaning and praying. All were pleading for help, but I couldn't get to them. I ran to summon our volunteer firefighters, thinking that if we got the flames somewhat subdued, then we could get in and save some of the folks. They were all burned up, though, I guess before we got 2 streams of water playing on the fire. Even while the bricks were hot, we began searching the ruins in the hopes that possibly we could find someone yet alive. The beating of the drums in the orchestra kept Mo Ashley from hearing the blast. Ashley was sitting by the trap drummer, Carl Mullins, at the time. "It's all like a nightmare to me," Ashley related to a Gazette reporter. "I just felt myself going up and then coming down. I remember hearing a woman screaming, 'I'm burning up!' My feet got hot. Then I crawled out from beneath the wreckage and took 2 or 3 steps. Somebody took my arm, and I fainted." Ashley is at the home of his parents, Mr. and Mrs. J. D. Ashley of South Curry Street. He has a bad cut under the right eye and his legs are bruised. Ashley went to the dance with Miss Evelyn Conklin of Kansas City, his fiancée, here on a visit. John Riley was dancing with Miss Hazel Slusser of Willow Springs, lost in the fire, when he heard a deafening detonation. "It was a terrible experience," Riley said at his home on East Main Street when the reporter found him in bed, his hands and head in bandages. "When I recovered my senses after the explosion, I found myself covered with debris and saw fire coming. I heard people screaming all around me and fought my way through the fire and luckily came out in the street." Wiley's dancing partner, Miss Hazel Slusser, perished. Swathed in bandages, Glenn Moore, son of R.B. Moore, white church farmer, told a reporter Monday how he escaped from the fiery hell. "I was dancing with Miss Ernestine Cunningham when the house simply felt like it was falling down. We were near the east wall, which seemed to hold the roof timbers off us. I heard her say, 'My God, I'm on fire!' And then I awoke to a realization of the situation. I worked and pulled to free myself, tore my clothing from my body to free myself. Then I helped Miss Cunningham, who was weighed down with timbers and was burning. Both of us then walked out on the street. Moore was burned about the face and ruptured a blood vessel in his right arm." Mr. and Mrs. B.B. Owens and their 4-year-old daughter were asleep in the rear part of the building between the dance hall and the West Plains Bank. Owens conducted a grocery and cream station here. "We were awakened by the explosion," Mr. Owens said. "The whole earth trembled. The building shook. I told my wife, who was sitting up in bed, there must have been a tornado. She screamed that we were lost. Then flames began to creep up in and almost touch us. I took the baby and protected her as best I could, put an arm around my wife, and started to get out. We finally made it. Both Mr. and Mrs. Owens were burned. The baby escaped without injury." Elbert and David White, sons of E.C. White, newspaper publisher of Doniphan, who were severely bruised and burned, said they had danced several dances. Just as one dance was ending, the floor of the hall seemed to buckle upward as there was a low rumble, followed by a sharp, cracking detonation. David was dancing with Miss Frances Drago, who was killed. They both, he said, seemed to be thrown upward. "My body was all humped together, and I don't know how far up I went," David said. "I saw Frances start up too, and then we both came down together. A lot of bricks and timber fell on me, and I guess I lost consciousness for several seconds. Then, when I recovered, I saw flames bursting out all around me, and I began pulling myself out of the stuff that was holding me. Finally, I got out and walked through the debris to the street. I dimly remember hearing folks all around me screaming and moaning. Someone who knows me, running to the dance hall, took me to the hospital." David, when he was found, had on only parts of his coat and shirt, his trousers, shoes, and socks having been torn from him by force of the explosion. His hands, head, and lower part of his body were badly burned. It was observed that the backs of most of the young men at the dance were not burned badly because of the protection their coats gave them. Young women and girls, however, who wore sheer dance frocks, were badly burned on all parts of their bodies. Albert White of Doniphan, swathed in bandages which covered more than half his body, said at the hospital late today that as he danced, Miss Frances Drago, his partner, was torn from his arms, and the next thing he remembered was finding himself bleeding in the middle of the street, with only his belt and shreds of his trousers as clothing. Observers declared that those nearest the front of the building were thrown with the wall into the street, while the rest were tobogganed with the collapsing floor and walls into the flames below. White's condition is critical. His brother, David, also at the dance, was thrown into the street, while his dancing partner, Mrs. Wallace Rogers, is among the missing. Miss Drago's body has not been identified. Another victim was added to the dance hall horror of April 13th when Albert C. White, Jr. of Doniphan succumbed to his injuries last Friday morning, just a week after he had fought his way out of the inferno. The body was taken to his home at Doniphan and buried Sunday. The funeral services were held at the Presbyterian Church in Doniphan, conducted by the pastor Reverend D.W. Jones and Reverend A.L. Whitfield of Steelville, who was pastor of the Presbyterian Church at Doniphan at the time White joined the church several years ago. At the grave in Oak Ridge Cemetery, the body was given a military burial by members of Company 1 of Doniphan, of which he had for several years been the bugler. William Fitchett, glass dealer and glazier of West Plains, was seated with his wife on the East Main Street side of the dance hall. His wife is a daughter of Porter Gray of Moody and sister of Pete Gray, who also escaped death. I felt like I was in a dark room when I heard the crash. Then it was like somebody taking a flashlight picture. Then it seemed we went sailing away. We shot up and came down. I could hear my wife calling for me. It seemed an age until I could free myself. There were bricks and timbers all over me. After I got free, I pulled my wife out and then went back to get Mrs. Garrett McBride, who had been sitting next to me. Someone else got Mrs. McBride out. Mr. and Mrs. Fitchett are at the home of Gail Johns on East Main Street. His back is badly sprained. Mrs. Fitchett's hips and legs are burned and her head cut. Brant Luna, a high school student, was seated on the steps leading to the dance hall. He was thrown outward by the blast. The explosion, he said, seemed to force the whole length of the steps outward. I just went with them. The youth, after realizing what had happened, assisted several persons from the fallen buildings. The explosion was heard at Mountain View, 26 miles north of West Plains. Chester Arthur says he was locking up his restaurant at the exact hour of the explosion, 11:04 o'clock, and distinctly heard it. C.A. Wright, publisher, Oregon County Times leader at Koshkonong, says he, together with others at the Peach Center, 18 miles east, heard the report sounding like a bomb. J.E. Threlkeld at Brandsville, 13 miles east, said he thought it was an earthquake when he heard it. All the lights in the town were put out because of the damages to the power plant, and in the darkness the work of the volunteer rescue crews was hampered seriously. The intense heat of the fire also kept them back until streams of water had been trained on the ruins for 2 hours. By 5 o'clock this morning, 28 bodies had been recovered, including that of Mrs. Kitty McFarland, an undertaker, and Major Robert Mullins, her dancing partner, to whom she was engaged to be married. S.T. Osborne of St. Louis, a salesman for a coffin company who was spending the night here, took charge of the McFarland undertaking establishment and assisted in caring for the bodies of the dead. With the coming of daylight, the rescue workers who had been on the job since midnight were relieved by other volunteers, and the work continued uninterrupted. Steadily digging away in the debris, they recovered 9 more bodies throughout the day. Most of the victims were burned beyond recognition and were identified by jewelry, clothing, or dental peculiarities. The body of Weiser, with a doorknob in his hand, was found about 40 feet from the wreckage. A motorist who had parked his car near the garage is believed to have perished also. The death list might have been larger had not 10 dancers decided to sit out the foxtrot in progress when the explosion came and were in a nearby cafe. The dance hall explosion at West Plains was a horrifying event that people in West Plains still talk about. I want to dedicate this video to the memory of the 40 people, many of them extremely young and at the beginning of their lives, who lost their lives in this horrible disaster. Thank you for joining me, and I will see you next time for another historical adventure.